Welcome, everybody. We'll get everybody in from the waiting room and we'll get going. Brian, I'm going to have to take over screen share temporarily to share the video.
Sure. Here, I'll get off.
Thanks. Okay, we'll give it one more minute. Get everybody in here. Okay, room's filling up. All right, so why don't we start on time since we have a busy hour ahead of us. Hi, my name is Michelle Hebert, Director of Communications here at SANES. And welcome to today's webinar, What You Need to Know About Foundation Aid. Before we get started, we're going to hear a brief word from our sponsor, Hunger Solutions. All right, thank you, Hunger Solutions. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. As we admit people, for now, we're going to ask everybody to please mute so it doesn't get too loud, and then we can do some Q&A as we go and at the end. But for general time, let's please stay muted. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Bronson, SANES Director of Professional Learning. Karen?
Thanks a lot, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion about understanding state aid and the governor's proposed budget. It was, I was going to say just about a month ago, but I was told it was a month ago exactly that Governor Hochul made her announcement about foundation aid. And as you know, that has a tremendous impact on your schools and districts. So we are very happy today to be bringing together Dr. Cindy Gallagher, our SANES Director of Government Relations, and Brian Czechnicki, who is the Executive Director of the Association of School Business Officials, of New York, for this conversation. So you will be in good hands with plenty to learn on this complex and important topic, and plenty of opportunities to ask questions too. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Cindy Gallagher. And I'd like to remind everyone, please stay muted unless you'd like to unmute to ask a question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. I loved that introductory video. It either made us all hungry or at least it made us all wake up. So I appreciate that one. Hi, all. It is a pleasure to be here. Brian and I are really excited about having the opportunity to present this information today. Brian and I have worked together for quite a number of years. And how I even got involved with the foundation aid and state aid is, I hate to admit it, but back in 2007, Brian, when the foundation aid formula was just being constructed, I was at state aid, only I was in special ed at that point. So it was fascinating being on this task force that had some role in creating at least the concept for foundation aid. And then Brian has worked, he'll tell you about his experience, but then when he came over to state ed, and was CFO for state ed in terms of all of the fiscal end of things. And then Brian is now at ASPO, and he is just an expert. And it's always been a pleasure to work with Brian. As I said, we've wanted to do something like this for a couple of years. And you may ask why. Well, simply being over the last couple of years, there has been a greater attention to building level finances. If you recall, that first started to emerge when all the federal stimulus money came in, and part of that was that not only do districts have to report at the district level, but at the building level. And then Brian and I took a course at Georgetown, which was really interested in talking about the building level role in school finance and understanding how that works for your school and how to use that for school improvement. Then I started talking about it at conferences. And as soon as I did, I will be quite honest, most of the audience got this glazed over look. And I could never tell whether it was because you all just thought it was not, not really, I know it's not really pertinent to every day of your job, but it certainly is a basis, I think, for a skill set and knowledge that our building principals, I hate to use the word should have, but it would be good to have in your arsenal of knowledge. One, to communicate with your business officials, but two, to really understand it for your own PD, to advocate for your school. And then again, if you have any career, other alternatives thinking about district level positions, it'll always be welcome. So that's kind of why we wanted to. And then, more immediately, I think this governor's budget is just fascinating for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about throughout the day. But it also gives us an opportunity to discuss not only the budget and how it will impact your schools should it be enacted, but because of the way that some changes were made, it gives us a good opportunity to talk about some of the basic concepts about foundation aid and what goes into it and how every little part can really impact some of the decisions made at your district. One of the things I know is that because I've taken them and building administration courses and IATs, you spend a lot of time on TAPU and all the other minutia. And in actuality, when we're working with school districts, I don't use that stuff very much at all. Really what we're looking for is the big concept of what is foundation aid, how it interacts with tax cuts, how it interacts with extraordinary needs, how it last year's budget, inflation. And those are the things that we're going to talk about today that I don't think you usually get in some of your coursework and admin programs. And then lastly, what I just wanted to kind of highlight is one of the reasons we're talking about this, just to set us off, and I'm going to send it right over to Brian, is every year, the reason we're doing this is that the governor has to submit a balanced budget. And so it gets conflated in that some of the initial reports at our fall conference, everybody at that conference was asking during the presentation, well, we hear that drastic cuts are coming because the projections for our state budget look like the revenues are down. And in fact, with those projections, the governor is incumbent by law to have to put forth a balanced budget. That does not mean that's where it's going to end up. And certainly each House, the Assembly and Senate will next propose their budgets. There will be a lot of negotiations, and all through that process, both Brian's ASBO group, our SANES, along with our thousands of other colleagues, are in communication with the legislature, the governor's office, on how we know it's going to impact. So, Brian, I think that's about, as much of the background I want to give. I know that we're going to be talking things. Brian and I are going to bounce back and forth. I'd like to hand it over to you so you can introduce yourself a little bit to the crew here.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. There we go. Yeah, and just to echo what Cindy said, we've been talking about this for a really long time. I think it's important that that we utilize the relationship we have, both, not just Cindy and I, but also our members between the two organizations. And I think, in addition to some of the things that Cindy said, we also recognize that many of you go on to be superintendents, and so you're going to be dealing with our members and with these issues, and so it'd be great to have some of that background. Before I get too much further, I will acknowledge, in my time at SCD, as I'll talk about here briefly, I had a chance to meet with many of you on a couple different topics. I have to give a shout out to Bonnie Tryon, who Bonnie and I predate all of this, and that's a story for a later day. But really, always appreciated working with SANES, and happy to continue this with Cindy. So as she said, I'm currently the executive director of ASBO, but really I've spent my whole career in school finance, came out of grad school and spent nearly 8 years at the Division of Budget, all of them in the education unit. So I was with DOB when Foundation Aid was created. I actually started in the last couple of years of the Pataki administration. So I got to see all of those iterations. I have some of the scars from creating the GEA, not that I created it, but I was in the office as it was being created. So I, have gone through both, the ups and downs of Foundation Aid and cuts. After my time at DOB, I did a very brief stint at Questar BOCES before I ended up back in the governor's office for about a year. And then after that, I spent 6 years at SED as the Director of Education Finance. And as I mentioned, that's sort of where I did some work with SANES, I think probably particularly on the 180-day rule changes, which for those that were around for that, my apologies. Luckily, I am now lifetime banned out of that, so we don't have to talk about it, and I can forget that it even existed. But with all that, I think one thing that I've been saying recently to our membership is I've had the benefit of just being in the room when these things happen, right? There's no special knowledge to this. It's not complicated. It's algebra, but really it's the context is what's important. And so as Cindy said, I'm going to do the best I can not to get into the weedsy details. There's a few places here where there will be, but really it's the contextual pieces. And I've been lucky to have been around to understand those. And so I have felt strongly that people like me in my position have an obligation to share that information, because it's really important that that everybody has an understanding of it, because it helps us on the advocacy side when things like this budget happen. So with that, I'm going to go through a bit of some
Brian,
brief
if I might
overview.
just for a minute, Brian and I are at a little disadvantage here because we don't know the knowledge level of all of you. So I would encourage you to, use the raise hand to ask questions or put them in the chat so that we can gear the presentation kind of like a leveling off and on. So, we're taking a chance that this information will be valuable, but your questions and what you give back to us will be very helpful. Sorry, Brian.
No, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. Was
overlap with facilities. Yeah.
but if you're might want to make sure you're on mute if you're not looking at chat. So before getting in, I do want to just do like a quick overview of sort of why we're here in terms of what the governor has proposed, and then get into some of the overview explainer stuff. So the governor, it's one of those, the little bit of the political sleight of hand. If you listen to her budget speech about a month ago, she talks about how there's more money in education than ever before, and there was an $800 million increase. But really what was baked into that $800 million increase was a $168 million cut to half the state. And that was really through her Foundation Aid proposal. Half the districts in the state would receive an increase, but literally half of the state would be cut. That cut is distributed around the state roughly in the same percentage, or the same proportions that student enrollment is. So about a third is in sort of what I consider the downstate counties, and 2/3 in the rest of the state, and that's really consistent with overall enrollment. But the vast majority of that cut is really concentrated in high and average need districts. And one of the things that we know from just how that average need designation was developed is that there's a lot of what we would consider to be high need districts in that category. It's essentially just an arbitrary cutoff where if you're on this side of the line, you're high need, and if you're on this side, you're average need. Excuse me, but really they're very much conflated in that middle space there, and so a lot of average need districts do demographically appear to be high need. And sort of to me, what sort of the biggest takeaway in what the governor's cut is doing, because I don't know that it's, I don't want to cast aspersions, but I think there's some improve. If you're trying to save money, you would probably do it a little differently. But one of the things is that the percent of what we call total general fund expenditures, which is just a measurement of a district budget, this cut represents between 0 and 12% of district budgets, depending on what your district is. And so 32 of those 337 districts, this cut is 5% or more of their budget. So if you think about, the coming months with those budget conversations, those districts with that large of a cut 5% is a lot, right? That's a lot of teacher salary. That's a lot of programs. And so, that's why it's really important that we understand this and how we got here. So, with that sort of setting the stage, I want to talk about, I'm going to give just a brief overview of school finance generally, and then, how what I just described about the cuts, what you should be thinking about, from the SBO perspective. We actually had a webinar recently on exactly this topic. A lot of our members, even though they're very experienced in this area, a lot of them are new, in that they were not around for the last time the state cut aid, and so it requires sort of a different thinking model for putting together your local district budgets and talking with building leaders and the board and your general public. And then then we'll do some little bit of drilling down how to read the state aid run and understand it. It's printed on a 40-year-old mainframe, so the visually it's not great to look at. But then do some deep dives into those state aid calculations and foundation aid.
And what we're hoping, I mean, when I ask our members, Brian, about how much, and I know it varies. I know if we polled everybody on who's participating today, I'd get a different answer. But on general, I would say that our members do not communicate a lot with the business officials in the district. And I know as soon as I say that, there will probably be 10 of you who raise your hands that we have a great communication. It's not that I don't mean you don't have communication, but that kind of planning, and when you know what's in your building, resources and the runs as it applies to your districts, I have found in talking to our members, Brian, that it's just not a lot of communication. So to your point,
Yep.
Yes, if we could increase that school official building principal communication, and I know you're doing it on your side with your members.
Yep, absolutely. So this first slide, just to give some context of school finance in New York. Every state's a little bit different, but essentially roughly 40% of all school spending is derived from state aid. And the remaining, 57% is coming from local taxes, the vast majority of which is property tax. There are I think it's only New York City and Yonkers do have the availability of some income tax that also goes towards education. But it's important to know this, because when we talk about how much money New York spends in education and how much aid there is, it's not even the majority of the spending, right? It's a very high cost state. We have many school districts, so there's a lot of different issues that sort of generate that. But even looking at the overall state picture, it's going to be very different district by district, and that's because our funding formulas are calculated in a progressive manner, which means that districts that have fewer needs receive less in state aid. And so think something's missing on the legend here, but just comparing two districts, so a high need urban district compared to a low need suburban district. The high need urban district, 80% of its budget is coming from state aid, and that's because it has a low tax base, and the state aid formulas are constructed in a way to make sure that those types of districts with high student needs and low wealth receive a greater proportion of state aid. The low need suburban district, on the flip side, is only getting 6% of its budget from state aid, and 93% of it's coming from its local property taxes. Both of those dynamics mean different things in terms of budget politics, both at the state level and the local level. It also means that they have different abilities within the property tax cap of raising local revenue. The high need district that has a small base that's coming from property taxes, if you're capped at 2% of a low base, it's going to be a smaller dollar value. Whereas the lower need suburban district, because their levy is so large compared to their budget, a small percentage increase actually yields quite a bit dollar wise, and often gives them greater flexibility for raising revenue, especially in times when the state revenues are low or are being reduced.
And I don't know, depending upon your questions or where Brian goes with some of this, and so for your low need, you can see the kind of the interrelationship there with the tax cap, right? If so much of their revenue is based on property within their region, and to have that cap and then have the kind of cuts that that Brian was just talking about. I suspect we'll hit on that more, but I just want to make sure that you're seeing all of this and bringing it into your thinking as Brian talks about those slides.
Yeah, and the way to think about it, the other way to think about it in comparison to, like, if you think of staff salaries, right? A person making 40 grand a year getting a 5% increase in their salary, that dollar value is going to be much smaller than the person making 150 grand getting a 3% increase in their salary, right? So the percentages seems like you know, the $40,000 a year salary is getting the better deal, but when you're looking at actual dollars, you know, that higher base on the higher salary is actually better. And so in the context of state aid cuts, that can come into play. The other piece, drilling down a little bit then into the state aid side of things, state revenues are then divided into a number of different funding formulas. Foundation aid is the largest one. That's the one that gets the most discussion. And rightfully so, because it's over 2/3 of all funding that goes to school districts. But there are a number of other formulas. There's a small portion of what I consider to be other operating aids. Those are just like foundation aid. It's flexible money. It's just a calculation that's determined, and the money is given to the district, essentially no strings attached. And then a little over a quarter of aid to districts is in what we call reimbursement aids or expense-based aids, and those are really those are reimbursements for actual expenditures. So transportation, some of the special education spending, buildings, your school construction, those things, the state reimburses a percentage of your actual costs. And so it's not an entitlement in the way that foundation aid is. It is based on what you spend. And so if you have to cut back on some things, you actually get less aid as a result as well, because it's just a percentage of your total expenditures.
And I think it's just to underscore, I mean, that foundation aid is the district's bread and butter. That's on which they make their decision making, and that's the ball game right there.
Yeah, and similar to the last slide I showed, this does vary by district. Some districts have a higher percentage of their state aid is coming from foundation aid than others. Off the top of my head, I think you'd find that actually more in the sort of counterintuitively in the lower need districts, because they're actually receiving so little on the reimbursement side that even though they have small dollar values of foundation aid, it's a larger percentage of their state pot. So this slide I actually took from this webinar that we did with our members on what should they be thinking about. And so there's definitely some interplay here with building leaders. So the first course of action is impact determination. Looking at the cut, what does it mean in terms of how much of your district's foundation aid, how much of your overall budget, what is this? What is it on a per pupil basis, right? There's all these sorts of different ways to look at it, and how does this interplay with both what available tax cap levy space do you have, and what are your other aids doing, right? We see some districts have decreases in some of their other aids, not because there's a proposed cut, but just really on the expense side. If they are receiving, if they've spent less, they might be receiving less. And then planning and communication, those are really going to be the big ticket items for successful budget passage, especially if districts are going to have to make difficult choices as a part of this budget. We've highlighted for the legislature that even if these cuts are restored, districts are going to have to start sending out layoff notices probably right around the time that the state is finalizing the budget. And they're not going to love the optics of that. And in fact, I'm sure Cindy and I and some of our colleagues will get yelled at by staff from Albany about this money is getting restored. Why are you laying people off? But that's just the reality of the labor laws that process is going to have to go. So starting to plan ahead and thinking about what are the communication strategies around that going to be, because it is very possible districts may send out layoff notices and only a week or two later find that the money's coming and they don't have to do that this year. So how are you going to communicate that with your unions and with your local your local taxpayers? And then the next item here
and just one more thing, right, and where we are right now in this process is I'm going to say about 3 weeks ago, the Senate and Assembly held the joint hearings where we all get a chance to give our opinion about the governor's budget. And I will say that there were very little favorable responses to the governors, including many of the senators on the dais. So right now, what we're hearing from, let's say, Senator Mayer, from Kruger, no one's really happy with this budget. That still leaves us some time to negotiate. So they're all there are many who are in agreement that these cuts probably will not be sustained, but as Brian said, you're making decisions now.
Yeah, and even so, you know, I was at one of my chapters had a meeting this morning or this afternoon, and the question I got was, well, what do you think will be restored? You know, what's your gut? And I said, you know, my gut is, unfortunately, I do think the safe harmless cut side will probably get restored, but I'm not so sure that, as I'll talk about in a little while, she also made a change on the inflation factor used in the formula. And I said, I'm not so sure that piece is going to be restored, and that can have implications for many districts, even beyond those that are getting cut. The next two items that we chatted about with our members, collaboration, and one of the things that we talked about a lot was very much you all, that you know, the SBOs really need to be collaborating with building leaders, with the superintendent, to make sure that if there are any difficult decisions to be made, that it's sort of, you know, everybody in it together. What we'd hate to see is you know, we talked about SBOs, you know, not feeling like they have to do this alone or be on an island, but you know, if there are difficult decisions to be made, it's best to work together with all the interested parties, as opposed to just bring forward, well, we have to make cuts, and so here they are, right? There's definitely room for finding savings when you need to, if everybody's working together. And then the last point, you know, and this is really more for the members, but just what is the future going to hold in state budgets? Even if these cuts are restored this year, it's very clear that the governor is starting a conversation, especially in districts that have had significant enrollment declines over the years. And so we may be right back here a year from now talking about these same topics. And so what are we as organizations, what are school districts all going to be doing in thinking about this moving forward?
Yeah, Brian, we will get to that, but let's make sure that we really get to explaining the inflation change as well as the safe harmless, okay?
Yes.
We're
Yep,
getting questions
absolutely.
about those in the chats.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I'll run through the state aid run piece, and then when we get to the inflation stuff, I'll mention that. So this is a paper copy of the run. Hopefully, I don't know if all of you have seen this in the past, but these runs from 24-25 look exactly the same like they did in, I think, 1978-79 was probably the earliest version of these I've seen. You know, they come off of an old mainframe, the computers themselves aren't old, but mainframe software that that the state education department has that I used to oversee. And so these are not very intuitive to read and understand, just given how they're set up here. You know, they're kind of broken up. That the top is the 1 year, the bottom is the second year. So in budget parlance here, we're talking about 23-24 is what's considered the base year. Even though right now we're in the 23-24 school year, for budget purposes, because we're looking ahead, this is now the base, even though the year's not completed. And you know, next year is when we're doing estimates. So these are broken up by the years. They then go through and kind of pull together the major categories. Some of them are combined, some are not, but going through, you know, beyond, there's foundation aid as the top level, but then we've got all the expense-based aids and some of the other categories. And then after running through that year, it provides the estimates for next year. And it's always important to note that these are estimates, right? This is the governor's proposal. And so obviously they're estimated, but even when the budget gets enacted, they'll still be considered estimates, because districts are submitting claims throughout the year that change these numbers. So even what we see on the April run is going to be different from what we see a year from now, because those numbers will change. And then it breaks down what you see as a total change here, both in dollar and percent values. So, you know, in Albany's case, you know, they're looking at a 7% increase on the aid side. How that impacts the overall budget really depends, as I was mentioning, just on how much state aid you're receiving as a portion of your budget.
And so,
To
Brian,
make that easy,
and
yeah, go ahead.
just on those runs, just to give the participants a sense, there are many districts who, Brian, actually, if you could flip back to that
Oh, yeah.
prior slide. And if you go way at the bottom and see the total change, the total aid change for the one that Brian has circled, it's still a positive 6.1, right? But many of our districts on these runs, I'm looking at one now from Hamilton County. It is I won't name the school district, but a negative 24% change, negative 18% change, negative 23% change. So the way that Brian's going to explain what the governor did to foundation aid has severely impacted many of our districts, like greater than what Brian was saying, about a 5% cut. Some of them are seeing greater cuts than that.
Yeah, and actually Burn Knox right next to it is a good example of that. Burn Knox, it's a small percent of their aid, but $600,000 as a percent of their budget is actually pretty big. I forget off the top of my head, but I think they're in that top 20 grouping. So they're 5% or more of their budget because they're largely dependent on state aid, and they've seen a pretty significant enrollment decline over the last few years, which plays into how their cut is created, which, like I said, I'll get into in a second here. I know Bob Lowry at NISCUS also has done something like this. So there's two versions out there, but we've created a more user-friendly version of this run that organizes it a little easier, we think. And so this is out there on our website, and I'll share the website at the end of the presentation here. But I think one of the other key things to point out here that I know has been of interest to our members is that there's a lot of districts now who are on paper receiving money for universal pre-kindergarten, but they don't actually have programs, or they don't fully utilize it. And the state aid runs that the state puts together do not recognize that. And what that means is that a district that has no program might be showing a $100,000 increase in pre-K because they're going from no program, zero, and the state is assuming that their $100,000 grant they're going to spend in the next year, even though the district has no interest in doing so. And that often confuses sort of these increased numbers because it's an increase on paper that the district knows isn't going to materialize. So that's why we've kind of constructed this a little bit differently than what's on the official runs, because it's important to separate those out so that districts who don't have pre-K programs can see what their quote unquote true number is without sort of that confusion from the pre-K side.
And we can spend a whole nother 2 seminars on pre-K if we wanted to.
Oh, yes.
Not suggesting that for today. So.
And just understanding these state aid runs, there's a couple different versions. Throughout the year, the state updates the funding formula. So we actually saw some preliminary data back in November. It's what's called the current law calculation, or the current law run. SED takes all the data that it collected from districts early in the fall and publishes for the first time its estimates for the coming school year. This is just based on what's currently in statute. So none of the proposed cuts, none of those things. It's just what's on the books. For many years, this really hasn't mattered because the foundation aid formula wasn't fully funded, and so there was always some uncertainty about, well, we don't know how much they're going to fund. Now that it has been fully phased in, the November data is actually really helpful because absent any changes in statute, we would already know what we could expect in the budget. The version that came out that most people are now familiar with is the governor's executive budget run, which includes all of the changes that she's proposing that we'll be talking about here. But where the governor is proposing that's something less than the current law, it's only showing her proposal in the executive budget. So there's some knowledge that we have because the other data is publicly available, but you wouldn't see that just from the governor's budget materials. It's something that you have to go back and look at the other materials, which is one of the things that we look at.
And the irony of having, as Brian mentioned, the full phase in for the first year is not lost on us. That the first year of the full phase in is exactly the same year that the governor decides to change something so that you don't get the full phase in amount.
Right. It took 17 years to get to this point, and then we didn't even get to have it for a full year. diving in a little bit deeper just on, you know, what is foundation aid. Same with pre-K. I can do an hour session on this. So just a very brief overview, but it's a formula that essentially starts with a single dollar value for all school districts. It's the same starting point, but then multiplies that by a number of different factors, including pupil needs. So it looks at a couple different measurements of the needs of students, and those that have a higher proportion of students with need get a higher multiplier. And then it also multiplies it by a regional cost index. And so it looks at the cost of living across the state and recognizes that, you know, the downstate counties, Long Island, New York City, Westchester, the Hudson Valley, those areas that have higher cost, all else being equal, you're going to need to spend more / get more aid to pay for those things. And so it has a scale according to that. And then it reduces from that calculation what an expected local contribution. So it's looking at the wealth of the district and saying you are able to, you know, levy some amount in property taxes. And so we take away from sort of this total spending number that you need, what we think the local share should be, and what's left over is the aid amount. So with that overview, sort of talking about what the governor did in this budget, she did two things. One was the inflation factor, and that reduced that starting point for all districts. So it's not a
Brian, go
cut.
slow there just a little bit. So what he's talking about is he has a big box there, foundation aid, but there are certain components in that were manipulated this time. And one of those components is the inflation rate. Sorry, Brian, but I just wanted to make sure that we understood where we were in this one for our.
Yes, no, so thank you. I should have had that circled on there. So yeah, this foundation amount, as I was saying, it's the same starting point for all districts, but how that number is determined is based on what's called the successful school study that the state education department conducts from time to time. When and that looks at you know, sort of high performing districts and how much money those districts spend to achieve those results. What happens in years where there isn't a successful school study, and the department hasn't done this in a number of years, is they take the most recent number and adjust that upwards by an inflationary factor. And so it, again, recognizes that costs increase. And so over time, even if you haven't conducted this study, there's an assumption that the cost of providing that successful education has been rising. What the formula currently has in law is a 1-year inflation factor. So it just looks at the last year, you know, the last 12 months and says, okay, inflation went up by X%. We're going to multiply this number by that percent. So last year, as you can imagine, this inflation factor was much larger because, you know, we saw very high inflation. But even this year, we're still about 4%. As the current sort of 12-month calculation. So the number, that starting point number from last year would have increased by 4%. But what the governor did was change that 1-year inflation factor to what I call a modified 10-year average. So there's a 10-year average that sort of lops off the highest year and the lowest year. And that had the effect of reducing that increase from 4% to about 2.5%. So it's still an increase from the previous year, but it's significantly less than everyone was expecting and less than what we see in the estimates from November. That change impacts all districts because it impacted the starting point that all districts use. And so every district, regardless of whether they are unsafe harmless or not, sees the sort of the potential amount of aid for this year reduced from what it would have been. The second piece is the safe
Brian,
harmless.
hang on for a minute. Why don't we take a beat? Why don't we take a beat here? It's a good place to take one and see if we have any questions, because we've given them a lot of information. Take yourself off mute. If you've got a question, comment, please feel free. Otherwise, you know, we can keep on going, but I'd rather make sure that we've got questions that you might have had from your district or anything. So take yourself off mute and just pop up. There was somebody in the chat who's had a question that they didn't understand how, or what was the idea behind the inflation rate.
So
Let's give
on
them
that,
a chance to ask, but hold on before we hop in. Anybody want to pick up on that question who asked it?
Yes, that was me, Joanne George from East Aurora, Western New York.
Yeah, Joanne. Hi.
Hi. it's just mind boggling to me because we still have to buy cleaning products that are increasing at 4%. We have to buy, paper towels. We have to buy mops. We have to buy paper. We have to buy crayons, all these things. So I don't understand the logic behind that. Well, I understand how it works for the state. I don't understand how it makes districts successful.
Well, and you answered the question. It's what makes logic for the state, and that's where the analysis ends. Oftentimes, what we see in proposals like this, it is about them having to hit a certain target of, we have to save X dollars, and so we're going to do something to do that. And sometimes it makes logical sense, and sometimes it doesn't. And you're right. In sort of this high inflationary environment that we've been in, simply saying like, oh, well, actually, you don't need that much of inflation adjustment doesn't make sense. And that's one of the reasons why, this proposal has not been well received because, there isn't sort of a logic to it.
And also, Brian probably has the number right off his head, but the amount of money that is saved by doing that is so minimal that in comparison to the budget, for the amount of grief that it's caused and the amount of ill will that it has caused, we all are just dumbfounded that the amount is so small by this particular savings. And yet the harm to the districts is monumental.
Right.
Yeah, it's the overall gap is about a little over 4 billion. And so these two provisions together represent it was something like 300 something million of that. So less than 10% of the total gap closing the state is doing is in these two in these two factors. So it is sort of in comparison in 2011 when the GEA happened during the Great Recession, those school aid cuts, which were many billions of dollars, were also a large percentage of the gap. It was like 30% of the of all spending and 30% of all of that gap closing. So it's it's a very different time to be doing that.
Joanne, I
Yes,
think you have
and-
one other thought. I'm sorry, go ahead.
My final thought, and I know I'm preaching to the choir. I've been in this business a long time and it gets very tiring, I guess. My other thought with her budget is how in the world does she think we are going to be able to meet the electric bus mandates with this type of budget? Where is that money going to come from? And one more thought with the increases in minimum wage, that has had a huge impact on our districts and our budgets. And it just makes absolutely no sense. So I don't know.
Joanne, excellent points. And, for this, if anybody else has a question, hop on, but we'll probably move to Save Harmless only because the two issues that you brought up were just excellent. I would love to spend more time with all of you. And if there's any interest, Brian and I are open to, doing this again in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, depending upon schedules, to talk about all those other issues that are pertinent to this budget. So we can handle it that way, Joanne, but your points are just right on. Any other folks who are, really want to make a comment here, or I'll ask Brian to move on to Save Harmless. Well, yours, Brian.
All right, great. Thank you. I agree. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. So as I said, these slides are going to get a little wonky, and for time, I'll try not to get too detailed here. But essentially, foundation aid and really the aid formulas that preceded foundation aid for decades in New York have always been treated that you get as much as you got the previous year. So even if you have fewer students, even if the formula otherwise says you should get less, we have just had a culture in New York of you always get at least as much as you got the previous year. This is the first budget that has really sought to do that. But there's a couple different reasons why foundation aid could see that decline.
And that's called Save Harmless.
So the Save Harmless is we're holding you harmless, we're saving you harmless to the amount you received last year, regardless of what the formula said you should get this year. And really, there's two key components that might cause that in a district. One is a decrease in the aid per pupil that the formula is calculating, and the other is a decrease in the enrollment count. And truthfully, the enrollment count is probably the largest driver of these. If you're a district that's lost 10% of your students over the last few years, the formula is going to be generating significantly less than you received before that enrollment loss. So as just an example here of, and I won't get too in the weeds here, but this is an example of a district that between 2007, when the foundation aid was first created, and this budget, that amount per pupil has actually gone up by $1,900. So they're getting more per student as a result, but they're what's called here the selected TAFBU, but that's essentially a weighted enrollment count that's used in foundation aid. That amount has declined by quite a bit, basically more than a third. So it's gone from 1,400 weighted students down to 900 weighted students. That loss of 500 students, it's what's really driving them to be on Save Harmless and them to be receiving a cut in this proposal, because there are fewer students for the formula to be providing funding for. This is shown graphically here, and again, I won't get too far into detail here, but I'll just point out the red line moving from left to right is the amount that the formula is actually calculating. And so you can see in these early years, there's a gap between the dark blue, which is how much aid the district was receiving, and the orange, which was at the time the phase-in amount. This was the amount of money that the district was promised under the formula that it wasn't actually receiving. And this chart would look different for every single district. Every district has its own dynamic. But in this case, in 2014-15, the calculation switched. And so this district went from having enough students that there was still a remaining phase-in available to now it was being on Save Harmless. And it was actually receiving more money than the formula would generate. And so you can see that trend then continuing on through this year, with sort of that Save Harmless amount growing, because over the recent years, there's been a minimum guaranteed increase. So even if you're getting more than your formula currently says, for the last couple of years, you were still getting a 3% increase. And so over time, this gap has started to widen for some of these districts because their enrollments declined and either leveled off, as in this case, or they've continued to decline. And so that amount of Save Harmless has continued to increase.
And that light blue is what the governor is targeting to want to change. I mean,
Yes,
they're going after their student enrollment. So we're not particularly fond of that thought, because one of the things we've also been proposing, as well as you have supported us in that, is let's make the foundation aid formula then, if we want to change it, let's do it methodically. Let's do it with updated numbers. And here you have the governor's office doing it automatically.
Yeah, and looking only at one factor, right? There's lots of things that go into this calculation. Her budget assumes that the only thing that matters is the fact that a district is quote unquote overfunded, and so some money should be taken away without considering any of the other factors that go into it. It might be the case that this district actually, if you updated all the poverty measures, should be receiving more than it currently does, but her budget doesn't take that into account.
All right, any questions on Save Harmless that you want to raise before we move on to a couple other areas? I think Brian's going to come back to Save Harmless just a little bit in another slide, but questions on this or thoughts, how it's impacting your districts, what you're dealing with right now?
I know I'm very verbal. It's Joanne again. Cherry picking just enrollment is so disingenuous, because the needs of our students have greatly changed, including the unfunded mandates to supply the services these children need, increases our costs, irregardless of our enrollment numbers.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I used in my testimony at the budget hearing that a lot of the legislators perked up about, if we look at sort of the top 20 districts in terms of their cut as a percent of their budget, they were a lot of very small rural districts. And so we did a deep dive into their enrollment count. And so those 20 districts were losing $19 million in aid. But when you looked at their enrollment lost, they had lost less than one student per grade per year for 10 years. So if you, and the legislators really perked up when they heard that, but obviously if you think about your schools, right, you lose a couple students per grade, what changes are you making, right? Are you laying off staff? Are you combining classrooms? Are you closing a building? Probably not. Are you reducing your bus runs? Probably not. And so this has been a very gradual decline, but even one that if you said, okay, well, this is 10 or 20% over a 10-year period, those percentages mean one thing, but if you translate into actual students, it's, you have to think about what does that actually mean? And could you actually downsize your school operations just based on losing that few of actual students, regardless of what the percentage is? And so, I think that's where there's a lot of the analysis here is missing, because it's just focused on, well, you're on safe harmless. Well, we're going to take a percent of that without understanding the real world implications of that.
And Brian, just to pick up, and that's, something at the top that Brian and I talked about, is that the idea of part of this is so that you can understand how your building dynamics really impact your district funding. So that one student that and I know absenteeism is different than enrollment. I'm not trying to conflate those two issues. But don't forget that absenteeism in our survey in the fall to all of our members was one of the top 2 priorities for our districts. So all of this, when you think about student enrollment, student participation, is really important for you to kind of keep an eye on, so that you know how that translates sometimes to the funding issues and what's being done. Not that you don't. Again, we're at a disadvantage. I don't know how much your communication is between, within your district, but just in case it isn't, here's good reason to understand this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's a nice segue to, some of the considerations to thinking about all these state aid amounts, really all the things we talked about here. Foundation aid, both sort of what the calculation is doing, but also what the governor's changes are doing. On the expense-based aids, again, this is more for your business officials, but how are your actual claims impacting how much you're receiving? Because even though it's money that you're receiving as a result of spending, it still goes in the pot there, and changes in your claiming patterns there could impact your availability for funding for other programs. The tax cap is really a big one, especially for many districts who are heavily reliant on state aid. As we were saying, there isn't a lot of opportunity for increasing above the tax cap, and districts are very hesitant to go out and ask their voters for that supermajority, right? If you want to go higher than your tax cap amount, you need a 60% approval vote. And we do see a clear distinction between districts that stay at or under the cap, pass with something like 99% success rate, and districts that try to go above that are really more 50-50. And so, there's a risk there to going out beyond that. But when things are tight and the state money is not available, it becomes really difficult to not have to consider piercing the cap and looking for that supermajority. And then, as I was just saying, the safe harmless, both sort of now and in the future, how that's going to play out over the years to come.
Right, I'm being cognizant of our time. It's 4:52. I just want to make sure Brian we have about 2 more slides. But I want to make sure that any questions at this point, any comments that we want to make sure that we're getting to those before we run up and butt up against the time frame.
Cindy, if I could ask too, if you and Brian can pop your email addresses up in the chat, that would be great. So if people have questions, maybe they can contact you directly too for more information.
Good idea. Yep.
I'm doing that right now. Yep.
Gary Manous has a question.
Hi,
Hi, Gary.
Thank you, Brian and Cindy. This is not easy to talk about. First of all, it's emotional. Joanne, I appreciate you saying what you did, and it's also technical. So thank you for trying to articulate this. I guess what I would ask everyone on the screen here is, as well as the hosts, what can we do as school professionals to try to advocate and save our schools in the next budget cycle?
I can start us off, Brian, if you want.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why don't you give from your perspective, and I'm happy to give the business perspective.
I would not hesitate for a moment to contact your regional assembly person and senator to really, but they want to know anecdotes. So I have asked in a couple of my government updates for you all to give me examples, and I've reached out to our government relations committee as well, everyone, give me examples specifically of how this could impact. Shelley Mayer, who is chair of the education committee, asked specifically of each of us, come back to me with specific examples of how this is going to impact. They are desperate to know that, because at the same time that Brian and I have been providing our testimony, you could see there was great, I want to measure my words. There was some confusion between the November runs and the proposed governor's runs. So there's maybe misinformation out there in your region, but either give me specific examples and I will transmit them as we do our advocacy, but do not hesitate to call your assembly person or your senators. I will be happy to provide the names of those folks to anybody who writes to me emailing, or I can just get it out and get a whole list of everybody by region. I can do that easily, Gary. Thanks for the question. Brian?
We would be happy to send the list that you're referring to everyone who registered for this workshop today, if that's helpful.
Yeah, Karen and Michelle are so supportive.
With any
Yeah.
specific directions that you have, that you just spoke about for how people could and should make contact.
And I was really going to say the same thing. The biggest thing is the understanding and the stories. Sharing that with your you're the administrator, so sharing that with your superintendent, sharing that with your school business official. If somebody's going to tell you your building's going to have to face a whatever cut, actually understanding what that means. The business officials, we did a survey. We only got about 100 responses, but of those 100, the vast majority of folks are really looking at, are there existing reserve funds they can tap into to deal with the cut, and are there just attrition through retirements and those things that maybe just don't backfill those positions. That seems like that's probably the story for this first year. But that won't be sustainable moving forward. And most importantly, we saw in those same results, it wasn't just the districts that are getting cut. The districts that are still getting an increase, albeit a smaller increase, are looking at the same actions. And so the more that we can collectively tell the legislature this is what's happening as a result of these changes, the better position they're going to be to sort of fight the governor on restoring them.
And it helps that this is an election year.
Absolutely.
All right, Brian, you want to take us home on the next couple?
Yeah, so just, again, sort of without getting into the wonky background, essentially what the governor did here is for those 337 districts on Safe Harmless, the percent of their cut ranges from 9 to 50% just based on how the formula was calculated. So some of those districts, 50% of their aid, and they're heavily relying on aid, ends up being a big chunk. But I think probably more importantly is there's no statutory phase out per se. I got a lot of questions. Well, if it's 50%, does that mean they're taking 50% this year and they're going to take the 50% next year? At least what's written on paper, no, this is only a one-time action. But the writing's sort of on the wall here. The governor and the budget director have both repeatedly said that they are looking at having this conversation about what do we do in districts where enrollment has declined. So even if on paper they're not taking away money beyond this year, it seems like that is a likely starting point in next year and in the years beyond. And then I think this is the last slide. Just very quickly in terms of how real are these cuts? I get this question a lot, just given my background with the state. Yes, there is a state budget gap. As I mentioned, this is a small portion of that gap closing. There are other avenues that the state has through other cuts in other areas. Sometimes there's less growth. Sometimes there's change in revenue estimates that can change that. So it is real, but the question of how real is it sort of leads to this budget dance, right? This is a negotiation. And so there is a pattern to a governor, whoever the governor is, coming in with a lower proposal and essentially, making the legislature meet somewhere in the middle because they want something that's a much higher level. And so how much of this is a dance? How much will the governor be willing to move back up? How high is the legislature willing to start? That's all really, that's an open question that we'll find out in the next couple of weeks. we've seen cuts like this before. 03, 04, and 11, 12 were sort of the two big years where cuts were done. But this year is very different for a number of reasons. Those years there wasn't a tax cap in place. Now there is. So in those years when there was a cut, districts were generally able to sort of make it up by just adding more to their tax levy. Districts are not able to do that in the same way anymore. As we've been talked about, we've gone through sustained high inflation in ways that we did in those years. And so the costs are a real issue for districts. And then I think, to me, most importantly, we're not in a recession. 03, 04, and 11, 12 were both sort of the state coming out of and in the midst of a pretty significant recession. The state's not in recession now. This is sort of an indiscriminate cut to school districts, for policy objective purposes, but not necessarily because the state's financial picture is impacted in a way that they need to be looking at this. So, where that ends up, it's tough to know. But as I've said a couple times here, even if all this money gets restored here, the enrollment declines that we see in many parts of the state are here to stay. And so this conversation is going to be here to stay because the governor seems to be wanting to have that conversation to be made. I mentioned earlier we have this is just to our ASBA New York website, but it's easier to give out this address than the full one. But we have a bunch of resources there. Your school business officials are aware of it, but there's some tools there. That user-friendly state aid run is there. There's also some materials that describe there's a budget FAQ, there's a description of the state's financial plan. So there's some other things there. So if you want to geek out on the finance side, we have some information there available. And we're going to continue to add to that over the next couple of weeks. Today is actually we've talked about these November estimates the department produced. Today is actually another database day. So I haven't seen we haven't gotten the data files yet, but SED is going to be producing new updates, and that won't necessarily change the governor's proposal, but it gives us some insight into what we might actually see in the final April numbers. So we're going to take a look at that and potentially produce some additional materials. So.
And I have, Brian, first, thank you. Thank you for committing to this with me and going along this crazy path to thinking that we might be able to do this. As I said, Brian and I are open. If there are other topics that you think we could cover, in a meaningful way to you all, please let us know. We have, please send us your examples of how this is going to cut. I know I want to give this right back to Karen because she has just a couple of messages for us and a couple of announcements to make of some really terrific upcoming PD things. So thank you all for trusting us with this information in this time that it would be beneficial to you. We hope it has. Brian, thank you for all of your work and all your collegial leadership on this. Brian is an amazing colleague, and go to that website. I just think you'll be professionally geeked out by how easily Brian has communicated what this all means. So Karen, thank you for your help on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Brian. We need help with this. We need interpreters and whisperers for issues like this. Brian made a comment early that it's not too complex. I don't know. To me, former English teacher and principal, it is. So we appreciate the help and dragging us through this information that's very important to know and understand. Also, it's just really good to bring different offices together, talking to each other. I think all of us as school leaders, regardless of our role, we get swept up in our day-to-day. We enter our office in the morning and a lot of days we're just swept away by our day. And we don't get opportunities to connect enough and to have conversations and understand things that people in different offices not too far from us have expertise in, really important expertise. So here at SANES, one thing we always try to do with our professional learning is connect people more so that we can help and support one another and also increase our collective understanding of issues like this that are really important. So thank you very much, Brian. We hope we have you back sometime soon. Thank you, as always, Cindy. I just have a couple of reminders for folks. One is, it is not too early to mark your calendar for next fall. We are going to have a fabulous annual conference in Lake Placid. We are so excited to be back in Lake Placid next fall for what promises to be a terrific conference. Much more information will be coming out soon. And one thing that will be coming out soon from my office is a call for submissions for the wonderful tabletop presentations that we do. So check our website. That announcement will be coming out soon, and then you have about 6 weeks to get one in if you'd like to submit something to possibly present. Also, another thing that's coming up is March 21st. We know that, oh, thank you, Michelle. We know that school absenteeism is another big, complex issue with no easy answer, certainly none that we're going to find in 1 hour or 100 hours, but we're going to keep working on learning and understanding more approaches. This one's a little different because it's a simulation. Schools, our friends at School Sims will kind of walk us through a situation that you might face as a school leader around the topic of chronic absenteeism. And it allows you, like, write your own mystery kind of thing, to walk through different pathways and see how you would approach that problem from different angles. So this is coming up March 21st. It's free to SANES members, so check it out. And I think that's all I have for today. Someone was asking one of my favorite questions, and that is, what is the theme and the approach to this year's conference going to be, and all that great stuff? Stay tuned. It will be revealed very, very soon, and you're going to like it. So check the website and submit something. Have a great evening, and thanks again, Cindy and Brian.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.